The new theater of the mind. The Bruce Collins Show.
Welcome back to the Bruce Collins Show. We're very glad to have you join us. The Bruce Collins Show airs every Friday night at midnight right here at WWPR 1490 AM. You can listen to past archives of the Bruce Collins Show at FringeRadioNetwork.com. That's FringeRadioNetwork.com. There's a tab just for the Bruce Collins Show on the Fringe Radio Network website. We would appreciate it if you're able to spread the word for our show by word of mouth, social media, or in whatever creative way you can. Also, we have a Facebook page for the Bruce Collins Show. Please like us there. And you can email the show at Bruce_Collins_show at AOL.com. We'd like to hear from you. Let us know how we're doing. Our guests tonight are Neil McCabe. He's a senior investigative reporter for HumanEvents.com and TownHall.com. He's going to talk about some things that have been horribly neglected by the mainstream news. You'll find that interview exclusively here on the Bruce Collins Show. Also joining us will be Patrick Wood. This is part one of an eye-opening two-part interview that will conclude next week. Patrick is the author of Technocracy Rising. The dark horse of the New World Order is not communism, it's not socialism, and it's not fascism. It is technocracy, according to Patrick Wood. With meticulous detail and abundance of original research, Patrick Wood uses Technocracy Rising to connect the dots of modern globalization in a way that has never been seen before, so that the reader can clearly understand the globalization plan, its perpetrators, and its intended endgame, and we're going to reveal the agenda tonight. Joining me right now is the author of Exo Applecana, The Paranormal Reasons Apples Keep the Doctor Away. He's also a former congressional candidate in Michigan and a military veteran, and he's the founder and executive director of Sling and Stone Outfitters, a 501c3 nonprofit organization that is dedicated to helping disabled veterans experience the outdoors. You can find out more information on his website, chadmiles.com. And, of course, we know him as radio's lethal weapon, Chad Miles. Hey, Chad.
Hey, Bruce.
You know, it's Friday night at midnight. How are you able to stay up so late?
I have a secret concoction of coffee, Coca-Cola, and Skittles.
Wow. So
and that's what fuels my late night hilarity and hijinks.
So you're still indulging in those red 40s, are you?
No, I strictly stay away from the red 40.
Oh, that's right. That's in Twizzlers, you said.
Yes.
Thanks, Chad, for helping us kick off the show this week and keep drinking those Skittles. Up next is senior investigative reporter for HumanEvents.com, Neil McCabe, and then part one of our interview with Patrick Wood. I'm honored to welcome my guest this week, Neil McCabe. Neil McCabe is a senior investigative reporter and editor at HumanEvents.com, and he's a columnist for the Canada Free Press and TownHall.com. Neil, welcome to the Bruce Collins Show.
Great to be with you.
Now, I was raised conservative Republican, so it was easy for me to move into that. Talk about your politics a little bit. How did you get here from there?
It's kind of a strange story, but I think a lot of people in my generation, 49 years old, sort of went through the same journey. I was raised in a very strict Irish Catholic, Boston Irish Catholic home, very democratic. Both sides of my parents' families were heavily entrenched in the Democratic Party. My father, as a young man, had been very active in sort of Boston city politics. Sort of worshiping Franklin Delano Roosevelt, worshiping James Michael Curley. But a weird thing happened to me is that all of the values that I was picking up from my family and from my church were not reflected in the Democratic Party in the 1970s. And it just stopped making sense for me to be a Democrat when, frankly, as a very young kid, Nixon, every time I heard Nixon or anything I read about Nixon seemed to make a ton of sense to me. I didn't understand Watergate when I was 8 years old, but it didn't seem like Nixon was being treated fairly. I just didn't know why. I mean, now, as a grown man, I know why. But then, of course, going into high school, you have Jimmy Carter running this country into the ground. You had 444 days of hostages in Iran. Mm-hmm. You had the oil, the gas lines. I mean, people talk about gas now, whether it's $4 or $2, and that's a big deal. But, when I was a kid, you might wait an hour to even buy gas. That's how bad it was at different times. And so, of course, coming out of high school, going to college in the 80s with Ronald Reagan, by that point, I mean, who wouldn't be a conservative Republican?
When you look into politics today, do you think that things are more corrupt, or is it that the press is more allows Washington, D.C. to be more transparent?
Well, what's happened is the media has really come out as partisans, and they see themselves as part of the team, not necessarily part of the Obama team, attached to Obama personally, but part of that sort of Northeast liberal elite. Mm-hmm. And, there was a time, say, example would be John Lindsay in New York City. The New York Times built up John Lindsay, who was a liberal Republican, but they created his persona and they supported him for mayor. And when he was crusading in New York City, the New York Times supported him every step of the way. But when Serpico, who was a police officer who became a whistleblower, when Serpico came forward and said that he had given Mayor Lindsay, evidence of police corruption, and Lindsay ignored him, the New York Times turned on Lindsay and said, "Hey, we won't be a part of this." And there was always this feeling that, yeah, we're liberals, we have a vision for America, but we're not part of the corruption. And if we see a story, we're not going to spike it. I would give you two examples of where we've gone from there. The first example is the Monica Lewinsky affair with President Bill Clinton, was given to Mike Isikoff, who at the time was a reporter for Newsweek, and at the time Newsweek was the same company as the Washington Post. Isikoff tried to get the story printed, but Newsweek and the Washington Post spiked it because they didn't want to hurt Clinton. And so Lucy Ann Goldberg, Jonah Goldberg's mother, gave the story to a kid she met called Matt Drudge. Right. And really, Matt Drudge was able to sort of burst onto the national scene with the Drudge Report with that story because it had been spiked by sort of the mainstream media. The second example, and really talks about some of the other things I wanted to talk to you about tonight, is that there's a group called ACORN, which is a community, sort of liberal community activist group, and they have a protected tax status so that they're a nonprofit, but because they're a nonprofit, they're not supposed to be involved in politics. What ACORN was doing is ACORN was taking their contributors lists and they were trading it with the Obama campaign in 2008. And you're not supposed to be coordinating, and you're certainly not supposed to be taking your internal contributor documents and giving it to someone else. So basically the idea is, this guy maxed out contributing to us. We're going to give you the name so we can max out contributing to you. Oh, you got $10,000 from Mr. Smith. That's Mr. Smith. Has he given to you? So you could basically cross-check these names to make sure that you've raised as much money as possible from the same group of people in two different buckets of money, ACORN and the Obama campaign, which were both working for the election of Obama.
Amazing.
Well, that story was given by a freelancer, was given to the New York Times in October. A woman had been working on it all summer, and then she finished it. She had been working with the editors. It was ready to go, and right before the story ran in October of 2008, the New York Times editors spiked it. Why? Because they did not want to be responsible for Obama losing the election. And that is, and that sort of signals a real change in what's going on with mainstream media, that they are now participants in the political process, and they actually are trying to pick winners and losers.
Incredible. Lois Lerner, as everyone knows, of the IRS, hounded Tea Party organizations, but apparently she's turned a blind eye to the actions of the Environmental Health Coalition. Can you talk about this?
Sure. The Environmental Health Coalition has been active in San Diego for at least 20 years. And it's really kind of that movement where, you know, you would take environmental concerns and marry them with healthcare concerns and sort of be part of that movement to sort of to marry the two as an excuse for more government involvement. You see the same thing when they try to declare gun violence as a health crisis, so that when they say we're going to regulate guns, it has nothing to do with your Second Amendment rights. We just see this as a health crisis. But getting back to what's going on in San Diego, what this group had done is, they had a very strong record of being players in the San Diego political scene. In fact, there were Navy yards and docks that were supposed to be, or a lot of people wanted to convert them into sort of a multi-use commercial waterfront, and it was the Environmental Health Coalition that blocked that. They were also very influential in the campaign of Ed Fulner, or Bob Fulner rather, who became the first mayor of San Diego who is not a Republican in about 30 years. And the problem is that they were listed by the IRS, or their category, where they were actually listed as a charity. And as a charity, you're not supposed to be active in politics. There are groups, you can file for a certain status, and there are categories where you can be a political action committee, and as a political action committee, you can be involved in politics. But if you are a charity or a social welfare organization, what that means is that donations to you can be tax deductible. And so what they were doing is they were using money that they had raised. There was tax deductible money. Money was being raised for them, and they were then paying campaign workers in these different mayoral campaigns. And so they were sort of paying out of the wrong bucket of money. Now, what's interesting with Lerner is that, it wasn't so much that Lerner was denying applications for Tea Party groups. What she did in the 2012 cycle is that she delayed decisions. And, if someone denies your application for a certain tax status, you can then appeal it. But you can't appeal a non-answer, a non-decision. And so what the IRS did is they took hundreds of these groups and put them on the shelf, so that when they went to contributors, the contributors said, well, some groups I can deduct my contribution, but if I deduct my contribution, my name becomes public. Other groups or other statuses, my deduction is not tax deductible, but I can keep my name private. And so contributors would then go to these groups saying, well, how, if I give you $10,000, if I give you $10, how is it going to be treated? And no one could give an answer because the IRS had put an all stop on the decisions. So not only could you not appeal a non-decision, it made it impossible to raise money and organize and to really get things going. Now, with the Environmental Health Coalition, they did all their filings, and if you read their filings, you see that they broke the law. And what Cause of Action, which is an advocacy group run by Dan Epstein in D.C., what Cause of Action is doing is all they're saying is, we request that the federal government read the filings that this group turned in and then act accordingly.
Yeah. And I guess the EHJC, they were endorsing, of course, Democrat Bob Filner, who later had to resign because of sexual harassment.
The guy was a train wreck. He was a sexual assault train wreck. And of course, the dirty secret is that everybody knew that this guy was a monster. But, liberal lechers get a pass, a hall pass. Right. And that's just the way of the world. We see that with Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr., he touches people in crazy ways. He says absolutely revolting, offensive things to women, especially young women. Things that, frankly, if he said it to my daughter, I'd punch him in the mouth. Yeah. I mean, just really revolting things that he says. But because he's a liberal, he gets a hall pass.
Right.
And that's sort of the same hall pass that this guy got in San Diego.
So is this unique in terms of how the IRS is now a political organization where they're targeting conservative groups but looking the other way at liberal groups? Is this only because Obama's in the White House, or has this happened in the past with Republican administrations?
Well, it's a very interesting question. I think that in the current age of partisanship, government employees and government bureaucrats see the Democrats and the liberals as sort of as like animals and with common interests. Certainly bureaucrats in the IRS recognize that the Republican Party wants to eliminate them, wants to cut their budget. Certainly significant Republicans want a flat tax, which would put the IRS out of business altogether. I mean, so there is some of that. But I think in the main, most people, like this particular office that dealt with these nonprofit groups or these tax-exempt groups, is based in Cincinnati. Most of those people were just regular Joes who in chains who went to work and from 9 to 5 and took a 90-minute lunch and then went home. Yeah. I think that they got orders from above to slow down the approval of conservative and Tea Party groups. I don't think it was anything truly organic to what was going on in Cincinnati. I think the directives came from Washington. We did see in the Nixon administration, in fact, one of the 3 articles of impeachment that the House Judiciary Committee approved to impeach Nixon. Of course, it never went to the full House, so Nixon was never impeached. He resigned, literally minutes before he was impeached. Mm-hmm. But in those 3 articles of impeachment that were approved in the House Judiciary Committee in 1974 against Nixon, one of them was that he was accused of using the IRS against political opponents. I'm not sure that it was the same thing. What Nixon did was Nixon would ask for tax returns, mm-hmm. and he would suggest that the IRS, like he would see people who he thought were abusing the law, and he would tell the IRS, hey, look into this. But it was nothing compared to what was going on in the Obama administration. Right. The Obama administration, or the Obama campaign, which is really the same thing. In 2012, the Tea Party scared the bejeebus out of them after what had happened in 2010. And so this was a deliberate effort to shut down Tea Party groups.
Neil McCabe, senior investigative reporter and editor at humanevents.com and a columnist for Canada Free Press and townhall.com. I guess 2016 can't come soon enough. Neil, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, thanks. That was great. I really appreciate it.
Me too. Take care. And joining us this week, once again, is my friend Patrick Wood. Patrick Wood is an author and lecturer who has studied elite globalization policies since the late 1970s, when he partnered with the late Anthony C. Sutton to co-author Trilaterals Over Washington, Volumes 1 and 2. He remains a leading expert on the elitist Trilateral Commission, their policies and achievements in creating their self-proclaimed new international economic order. An economist by education, a financial analyst and writer by profession, and an American constitutionalist by choice, Patrick has deep historical insights into the modern attacks on sovereignty, property rights, and personal freedom. Such attacks are epitomized by the implementation of UN policies such as Agenda 21, Sustainable Development, Smart Growth, and in education, the widespread adoption of Common Core. Wood is a frequent speaker and guest on radio shows around the nation. His current research builds on Trilateral Commission hegemony, focusing on technocracy, transhumanism, technocracy and scientism, and how these are transforming economics, politics, and religion. The endgame, if ignored, will result in scientific dictatorship. Again, it's Patrick Wood. His latest book is Technocracy Rising, the Trojan Horse of Global Transformation. And if you've got a pen handy, I've got a couple of websites to give you. Patrick Wood can be found at technocracyrising.com and augustforecast.com. Patrick, welcome back to the Bruce Collins Show.
Thanks, Bruce. Glad to be back again.
Yeah, it's been too long. I've been interviewing, I almost said debating you. I've been interviewing you since 2006. So about 8 years. Time flies. Now, take us back to when you first discovered that the world was far different than what you had thought, and then your meeting with Anthony Sutton.
I was a young guy back in those days. Seems like a long time ago on one hand and like yesterday on another. I was a young financial analyst in Phoenix, Arizona, actually, and I had been studying the economic world, the financial world, looking at corporations that make things and stuff like that, and I was young and naive. But when Jimmy Carter was elected president, I noticed pretty quickly that the people he was appointing to all of his top-level cabinet positions were all members of the same group, the Trilateral Commission. I didn't know what that was, and I was concerned because Carter said he was Mr. Outsider and didn't know anybody in Washington, and what would he do? How would he find people to, bring into his cabinet? And all of a sudden, one after another, these guys start trotting in from the Trilateral Commission, and just the fact that they were overwhelming his entire cabinet, not to mention he was a member himself as well as the vice president, I got really concerned, and I didn't quite know what to do with it. That's when I ran into Tony Sutton, by chance, by the way, down in New Orleans at a gold conference, and we happened to be seated at a breakfast table. We didn't know each other, but if we wanted to eat, that's where we had to sit. And so he started talking, and I realized very quickly that we were both kind of zeroing in on this group and what the heck was going on. Well, I didn't quite understand the power, the influence he had at the time, but Tony Sutton was a research fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. He was a seasoned researcher, a seasoned author, and had written more than any other scholar in history on the transfer of technology from the West to the East. So Tony had an eye for detail that, if he was alarmed, I need to be alarmed too. And so we committed right down on the spot to start writing the Trilateral Observer newsletter first, and then later we published a couple of books, Trilaterals Over Washington, as a result. And they did become kind of the definitive analysis of the Trilateral Commission for many years. Interesting.
Now, did you move to Northern California as a result of that, or had you already found yourself here?
No, actually, I was born and raised in Northern California, and I went to college in Tucson at U of A, so I stayed here. And, I only went back up, I think it was 1989, went back to Northern California, where my family was, and both my mom and grandma passed away since then, and, we decided to move from there. We went up to Idaho for a few years, and then back to Washington State, and then came back down to Arizona. We're back in Arizona now.
Did you go to high school in Tucson?
I did not. Okay. Just college, University of Arizona.
We have weird parallels. I was born in Northern California. I moved to Tucson in my teenage years, went to high school there. My brother went to the University of Arizona, and then I came back to the Bay Area. So that's very strange.
I'll be darned. That is strange.
Now, can you talk about your debate? I never knew this, but I read this in your book, Technocracy Rising. You had a debate on Larry King's old late night talk show. And then tell us about the subsequent events with B. Dalton.
Well, exactly. Larry King back then he was a young guy too, I guess, by comparison. But he was the overnight king, if you will, the king of radio, on the Mutual Broadcasting Network. And Larry King overnight, or I forget exactly what the name of the show was, but it was the biggest talk show anywhere. And I got invited to go back there and sit across the table with the executive director of the Trilateral Commission. His name was Charles Heck. He later became a member of the commission himself, but he was just the executive director back then. And it was only supposed to be a 1-hour interview, and it ended up being a 3-hour marathon. And during the show, Charles would throw out something that the commission was doing, and the callers would just get irate with him, and they'd call in and they'd throw rotten eggs at him, tomatoes, whatever, figuratively speaking. And my role in the debate at that point was to set the caller straight and kind of end up defending Heck. No, that's not what he really said. That's not fair that you should say it that way. Here's what they really said. And then I would lay out point by point their documents and stuff. And by the end of the show, he figured I was defending him. He didn't know I sliced him to ribbons. But Larry King shook his head at the end of the show and said, and remember, he was liberal, very liberal guy. Yeah. He said, "I have never seen anything like this in my life." And he shook my hand. That's the last I ever heard from him. That's the last time I ever saw him or anything. But I got a call the next day from B. Dalton. They were inundated with calls all over the country to buy our book, the Trilaterals over Washington. And they didn't know what the book was about, but they said, "Man, whatever you got, everybody wants it. Get us some sample copies right away so we can, get an order started." So I did. They said, "Well, we've decided not to carry your book." So, "Oh, really? Well, why?" I said, "Well, there's not enough demand for it." And so, we said, "Okay, there's something fishy here." So we started calling some B. Dalton stores around the country, just at random. They were easy to find in the phone book. And the answer we got back from when we asked for a book, "Can we order this book?" They would tell us that the publisher is out of business and that the book is out of print. Wow. That's what they told us. So we knew what had happened. They said, they all got a memorandum saying, "This is what you say when somebody asks for this book." What a rotten, stinking deal. We later found that B. Dalton was owned by the predecessor to Target, a giant global company, just happened to have a member of the Trilateral Commission on their board. So that was the end of our experience with B. Dalton, but we had a lot of fun with him later on, Bruce. We would call radio talk show hosts in various cities, and we would encourage them, as we were talking to them, we would encourage them on the blacklisting free speech issue. Hey, pick up the phone live and call B. Dalton and ask them to buy our book. And so, a bunch of talk show people did this. They thought that was great, a great stunt. So they'd call up the local store. "Hello, this is so-and-so with XR, BZ or whatever. And we'd like to buy a book." And they'd go shuffle, shuffle, shuffle after they, found out it was Trilaterals over Washington. Every time they come back with the same answer, every time the talk show host would freak out. "Well, I have the author right here on the radio with me, and he says that the book is still in print, and the publisher is here at this phone number, blah, 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 and this address. What do you say about that?" Well, they didn't know what to say. They're just, they're just punching the clock.
Right.
People on a local level, so they couldn't handle it. But it was quite the scandal in my mind. But we ended up having a little fun at B. Dalton's expense in the end of it.
Amazing. Now, as I said, I've interviewed you for many, many years, and you weren't using the term technocracy when I first started to interview you. What caused you to see this as the big picture problem, and can you give us a definition of technocracy?
In 2006, I didn't know what technocracy was. I didn't have a clue. And I'm kind of embarrassed I didn't. I thought I knew something about American history, but I didn't know anything about this. I can't honestly remember really exactly how I ran across it, but when I did, I immediately was intrigued. And when I found out, started digging into the historical movement of technocracy from the 1930s, which is what brought me to the big picture, I just couldn't let go of it because it had been suppressed from the history books. And yet, it was a very viable movement, political, economic movement back in the 30s. There were over, and on the West Coast, Bruce, there were over 500,000 card-carrying technocrats, members of Technocracy Incorporated. It was huge. But it was not in the history books. And so I started to research and study, and I came to understand pretty quickly that what the original technocrats specified back in the 30s was exactly what we're seeing today. So I started, working that one backwards. Where'd it come from? Lo and behold, it took me about 2 weeks to run into the Trilateral Commission. In other words, I would lay the development of modern technocracy at their feet directly as being the sole perpetrators and, the sole resurrectioners, if you will, of historic technocracy. It fits hand in glove.
So in a sense, would you say that you had identified the criminals, just not the tools they were using?
That's right. That's exactly right. I did not understand it. If Tony and I had understood technocracy back then, we would have pinned it on him right on the spot. I know that. I would have. I'm sure Tony would have too. But we didn't. We had no clue. And when the Trilateral Commission specified in 1973 that they wanted to foster a new international economic order, we didn't know what that meant exactly. I mean, we didn't push it any further because there was nothing to compare it to. All was in the world is capitalism. We looked at capitalism and we talk about, well, there's Keynesian, capitalism or theory of it. And there's the Austrian school, right? There's the Chicago school. That's how we thought about new international economic order. We just didn't have a clue. But when I discovered technocracy, it occurred to me what they were talking about was something really brand new. And technocracy was specified to, the model of technocracy was to be a replacement economic system for capitalism. That's exactly the way they wrote the specifications back then. They believed that capitalism was dead. The scientists and engineers that thought this whole thing up figured that they were the only ones that could run society according to the scientific method, that politicians had whacked it out and they needed all be fired, and, politicians are useless. And they alone, the scientists and engineers, would run society for the good of mankind.
So they're replacing capitalism. So if I see that Gartner Group late last year came out with a report that in 10 years something like 25% of the jobs will go to robotics, is that a long-term picture for them? In other words, 25% of the tax base, and if I'm way off, let me know, but 25% of the tax base is gone with robots. It seems to me that the corporations would prosper, but for a country that's in debt, I don't know how they're going to make up that loss. Does that look like something that technocracy would be bringing about?
Not necessarily. Technology is going to march on whether there's technocrats or not. And let me back up and say this. I am not anti-technology any way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
I love my iPhone. I love my computer. I love the technical gadgets that I have. I love the fact that if I need medical help, I can go and get stuff done at the hospital that was impossible 50 years ago. That's all good stuff.
Right.
What I have a problem with technology is when men of evil intent say that they're going to use technology to enslave me. So it's a matter in the end, who's going to serve who?
Right.
Is technology going to serve me, which I like that idea,
right? Or
am I going to have to serve technology? And the technocrats would say the latter. We will do what they tell us to do. And you know what? Probably early on here, we ought to bring up the religious nature of this whole thing. They essentially have created a false god of science. It's not real science in most cases, pseudoscience, but they have the false god of science. And the priesthood of the science are the engineers and scientists. And this is just like any cult or religion has ever been that sets up some kind of an unknowable God. Mm-hmm. And then a priesthood that has the ability somehow to hear what this God has to say. And that priesthood then will come, if you're lucky and you pay enough money, that priesthood may come and tell you what that God said that you should do. Who's to know what what that God really said? Namely, nothing. But this is what a false religion looks like, and the cult of science today is very much like that.
Yeah.
So if you're told that global, if global warming is the big threat, and they have determined that your carbon footprint is just simply too large and you are hurting the planet, well, you have to cut back on your automobiles, and you have to maybe ride a bicycle now half the time, and you have to live within 5 miles of where you work, and you have to start eating foods that will cause you to lose, 20 pounds or whatever. The list just goes on and on. They determine what you should do according to their scientific insight. Oh, this is nothing more than just a cult. In the end of it, it is just like, well, who gives you the right to tell me what to do? Well, science says it. Right. You don't believe the science? It's like, hey, science is inviolable, You can't go wrong with science.
Right. So, in early on in your book, Technocracy Rising, you have a chapter where you list several isms and influencers. And so it's in that same vein. You have philosophies and philosophers listed in that chapter. Can you tell us about some of those?
Well, I can. And, I have to say, I really don't like philosophy in general terms. It hurts my brain. But ideas matter. Mm-hmm. What's gone through people's heads in years past really matters. Is how we got to where we are today, by and large. But if you go back and kind of unwind all these different philosophies that were kicking around, especially back at that time, you had progressivism was a huge thing back in the early 1900s, as well as Darwinism. Darwin's Origins of Species was still being kicked around, and society was just wildly aggressive in adopting this in every way, shape, or form they could. Communism was real big back in those days. Socialism as well. Karl Marx was a topic of discussion especially because of the Bolshevik Revolution. Karl Marx was on the lips of a lot of people back then. Mm-hmm. And when scientism really started getting a grip especially on the scientists and engineers, the whole thing boiled down to how can you determine what reality really is? Mm-hmm. How do you find reality? And historically, people might look to different sources for reality. Maybe observation certainly would be one of them, but a lot of people look to the Bible for determining the reality of man and things about man, the character of man, and so on. And, there might have been other ways, other types of philosophical insights on morality or ethics and stuff like that. But scientism took positivism and put it on steroids. And they basically made the statement that the only way to discover truth about reality is through science. That was just their bedrock assumption. Without science, you cannot determine what is really real. And excluded every other model, including the biblical model, from their frame of reference. They completely wiped it out. So if it didn't deal with the scientific method, it wasn't real. And then as scientists and engineers, they decided that since they were experts at applying the scientific method, that they would do a bang-up job of telling us all what's real.
Yeah.
Now, I can debunk that thought, by the way, in just about 2 minutes. Take the subject of love. Mm-hmm. Love is a very human thing. Love is real. If you don't think love is real, just go tell your wife. I don't believe there's anything love. In fact, you're just a bucket of random atoms that, you have no value other than the intrinsic value of the atoms that comprise your body. You won't be married very long. Love is a very human thing. It's very real. It's been with us since the beginning of man. And you cannot equate love to a scientific formula. You cannot apply the scientific method to it either. It just does not work. And of course, there's all kinds of things about humans that you could say the same, you could derive the same thing. Other emotions and stuff. In fact, all emotions really, whether it be jealousy or anger or whatever, none of those things apply themselves to the scientific method at all. When you bring up ethics have nothing to do with scientific method either. Morality, no, not that either. So these people were operating an 8-cylinder car on 4 cylinders from the get-go. Here we are today.
Yeah. So in essence, would this be true that they wouldn't care if fascism rises to power or communism, as long as the end goal is anti-Christian and pro-technocracy? Would that be right?
Well, the interesting thing about how the technocrats have operated in history is they don't really care who's in power. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter to them whether it's a one-person dictatorship or whether it's a Soviet or whether it's a democracy. They don't care. They operated, for instance, under Adolf Hitler in World War II, didn't have any conscience issues whatsoever, but they were applying their science. They were applying their science and their scientific method in a regime that valued that science. Valued their technical contributions, because Hitler used that stuff to do just about everything he did during World War II, including the mass genocide and, the war machine that he had and so on. Mm-hmm. It would not have been possible without the influence of technocrats. And when I say technocrats, I'm saying technocrats with a capital T. Technocracy in the United States jumped immediately to Germany in 1933 and 4. And so there was a lot of people that were embracing, scientists and engineers that were embracing this technocracy philosophy in Germany. And even though Hitler clamped down on the use of, technocracy as association, they continued as technocrats all the way through World War II and enabled him to do everything he did scientifically. Yeah. So the technocrats operated like a submarine underwater, if you will. Mm-hmm. Nobody knew they were there, but right. they were, and they were very potent. They had a lot of power, a lot of influence, and all that mattered to them was just that they ran their operation according to the scientific method. They really didn't care about the political outcome of it whatsoever, mm-hmm. nor do they today. Right.
Let me make this point real quick. We're open to a brand new audience and a large audience in Tampa, Florida. So this may be all new material to them. But if they're watching The Simpsons, for instance, and The Simpsons are anti-Christian, but they're pro-global warming and all of these philosophies, would we be able to make a connection that it's the elites that are using media to promote this technocracy?
Oh, absolutely. Anywhere you see any kind of dogma coming up that pertains to global warming or sustainable development, or green development, or green economy, anything like that is related directly. It's a product of technocracy, mm-hmm. and technocracy alone.
Okay, let's go back. Columbia University is where we can trace this, right?
Yes. There were people talking before that were not at Columbia, mm-hmm. but when technocracy really kind of got cooking in 1931-32, was gaining steam. Popular steam. The two co-founders, Howard Scott and M. King Hubbard, got associated with Columbia University. And Nicholas Murray Butler, the president of Columbia at the time, is a real globe-trotting name dropper. Loved the international attention. He got enamored with technocracy and took it into Columbia, and for some time they actually gave space in Hamilton Hall to Technocracy's operations. So it really had an official housing, a start at Columbia. The association with Columbia caused the PR spin to go nuts. Because, people were looking for new stuff back in those days, and Columbia was kind of, on the edge of new stuff. So, have you heard what Columbia's doing? Have you heard about Technocracy? Man, they're endorsing this thing. It must be great. And so everybody got excited about Technocracy across the country. Well, it was discovered not long after that the co-founder and main promoter of Technocracy, Howard Scott, was a fraud. He claimed he had an engineering degree from somewhere overseas and that he was a genius and whatever, and he thought all this stuff up by himself, but then they found out he actually didn't have a degree at all in engineering. So Columbia got really bent, and they kicked him out. They just drop-kicked him. I mean, literally drop-kicked him back out into New York City. And both Hubbard and Scott found themselves organizational people wanting to get Technocracy going, but they had no home, whatever. So very shortly thereafter that, they created Technocracy Incorporated and used that as their platform to take Technocracy to the rest of the country. It's doubtful that they ever would have got anywhere, in a successful sense, had not Columbia originally picked them up like they did, because nobody would have cared. Mm-hmm. It gave them a credibility that they never could have gotten any other way.
Right. And again, the book is Technocracy Rising by Patrick Wood, Technocracy Rising. And you can go to the website technocracyrising.com. Now, you already talked about Nazi Germany and technocracy. And then, I guess, Zbigniew Brzezinski ignited the flame of technocracy in the West. And, of course, he was part of the Trilateral Commission. So how did the Trilateral Commission do this inconspicuously? How did they become the conduit of technocracy? What did they do to promote it?
Well, the main thing over the years was, number one, to develop the philosophy and then to put it into play. Mm-hmm. Once it was put into play, once it was on the table in a serious way, they needed to find some way to provide some contagion to it so they could spread it. Kind of like a virus, if you will. And the United Nations was a very convenient contagion that was already in the pocket of David Rockefeller anyway, and already had a global platform with which to draw people in and jawbone them and brainwash them and everything else. That's exactly what they did. But where it came, the way it became manifested, for instance, a good example is the Rio conference that produced, in 1992, that produced the Agenda 21 document that everybody's talking about today. Agenda 21 is where sustainable development was really established as doctrine, as a dogma. And the book that was produced out of that, with whatever chapter, I forget how many chapters it had, but it was a sizable book. Mm-hmm. And it contained all of the blueprints for the 21st century. That's what it's called, Agenda 21. That meeting was preceded in 1987 by a UN commission called the Brundtland Commission that was given instructions to create a blueprint for the future. And that commission produced a book called Our Common Future, which the United Nations acknowledges today was the singular work that paved the way for the Rio conference. They say that, not me. That's a good thing. They figured that out. Well, the Brundtland Commission was chaired by a lady by the name of Gro Brundtland. She was a prime minister from Europe. She was formerly, before that, an environmental minister. So she had a lot of environmental issues in her head already. And she was the one that orchestrated the book, Our Common Future. She was the primary author of that book. She was a member of the Trilateral Commission, Bruce. And where did she get all those ideas, and why was she encouraged to get in that position with the United Nations, in particular, to be the one to develop this document that would lead to Rio, that would lead to Agenda 21, and all the stuff with sustainable development we have today? all the stuff with global warming we have today, all the stuff we have with CO2 and ozone and, all the other ecological issues that we have today, all came from that book, Our Common Future. You can go back and buy it and read it. It's still on Amazon today. It's still in print. Shocking.
Yeah, it is.
She was a member of the Trilateral Commission. That's my point.
Yeah.
This was trilateral policy to plant the seed, to water the seed, to prune and groom the plant as it grew. And, wasn't it convenient then? Al Gore, member of the Trilateral Commission, and along with Bill Clinton, Al Gore became the spokesperson for global warming. Member of the Trilateral Commission.
Right.
Okay. That sounds a little bit like one scratching the other's back, right?
Yes. And Al Gore became the first green billionaire, didn't he?
Yes, he did. And he's still working at it. In spite of record sea ice today in the world.
Yeah.
He's still saying, no. There may be record sea ice, but it's all because of global warming.
Now, you mentioned earlier that technocracy will replace capitalism. What does economics look like under technocracy? Pretty ugly.
There's no ability. Property rights are wiped out completely. There are no property rights under technocracy. The economic system is based on energy, not on supply and demand and currency like we know it today. That means that energy and the availability of energy in the economic system will determine what people can actually, accumulate. Not accumulate, but expend on themselves. Mm-hmm. And energy is to be limited and regulated carefully to all the citizens that live in that energy economy. And there will be no provision at all for saving credits over into the next period. So they envisioned giving everybody in the society an allocation of energy credits at the beginning of the period, kind of like food stamps, maybe. You get your energy stamps.
Yeah.
You can spend them during that period of time, but if you run out before the end of the month, you're just going to have to sit on your hands. And if you don't spend them during the month, they were due to expire, and you get a new allocation for the next period. So there's no way to accumulate wealth. There's no way to, from time to time, there's no generational wealth, of course, going to be available under that. And basically, you have no property rights whatsoever. So any right that you have to enjoy anything, basically, is going to come from the technocracy.
Wow. Sobering.
That's pretty ugly.
Yeah.
It's pretty ugly. It's very totalitarian. It's very much like Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, which was written, by the way, in 1932. Go check the date on your dusty old copy on your bookshelf. And Aldous Huxley was looking straight into the face of technocracy when he wrote the book, Brave New World.
Yeah, and H.G. Wells wrote about an open conspiracy, and, of course, Zbigniew Brzezinski talked about the technocratic age, wasn't it?
Or technotronic age.
That's right.
He called it the technotronic. It was just a knockoff word.
Yeah. And just a reminder, Patrick Wood will be joining us next week for part 2 of the interview, Technocracy Rising. You won't want to miss this one. Also joining us will be actor Brett Wagner, known as the Big Schwag, and actress Dee Dee Bigelow. Thank you so much for joining us here at the Bruce Collins Show, where you can find us every Friday night at midnight here at WWPR 1490 AM. Remember, God loves you. We do too. Don't give up.
Morning brings your mercy, your faithfulness to me. New every day. Morning brings your mercy, your faithfulness to me. New every day. Evening brings your kindness, your love sustaining me in every need. Evening brings your kindness, I lift